The city's heartbeat was a cold, indifferent drum against the pavement, each beat a reminder of her invisibility. Leah moved through the rain-slicked streets, not as a person, but as a ghost carrying a life. The weight in her belly was a constant, heavy anchor, a promise of a future she had no way to protect. Every drop of icy rain that soaked through her thin jacket felt like a judgment, a whisper from the world that she did not belong. She saw families through glowing restaurant windows, their laughter a sound from another universe. Hunger was a familiar ache, a dull fire in her gut, but the fear was sharper. It was a cold blade pressed against her throat, the terror of bringing a child into a world that had already discarded her. She tried the entrance to a late-night bus terminal, hoping for just an hour of warmth on a hard plastic bench, but a security guard, his face a mask of weary annoyance, pointed a thumb toward the door before she even took a full step inside. "Not here. Move along." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The dismissal was in his eyes, a reflection of the dozen other faces that turned away, pretending not to see the swell of her stomach under the drenched coat. They saw a problem, a stain on their orderly world, not a young woman on the brink of motherhood. Leah didn't plead. She just turned, her shoulders squared, carrying the weight of their silent condemnation back into the storm. Her dignity was a fragile shield, and it was all she had left. The world had taught Leah that systems designed to help were actually machines that broke people apart. The very thought of a hospital, of social workers with clipboards and practiced sympathetic smiles, sent a tremor of pure dread through her. She had been a file number, a case, a child passed from one temporary home to another. They would see her, homeless and alone, and they would not see a mother. They would see a risk. They would take her baby, promising a better life, the same empty promise that had echoed through her own childhood. She clutched the worn teddy bear in her pocket, its button eyes a testament to the only constant she had ever known. She wouldn't let her child become another file number. Not ever. A sudden, sharp pain shot through her, stealing her breath and forcing her to lean against a cold brick wall. It wasn't just a cramp, it was a signal. A terrifying, undeniable countdown had begun. The baby shifted inside her, a powerful, desperate kick, as if it too knew that time was running out. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over her. The streetlights blurred into streaks of yellow. The city's noise faded into a dull roar. This couldn't be happening here. Not on a filthy sidewalk where the world could watch and judge. She had to find somewhere safe, somewhere private. A sanctuary, however temporary, where she could bring her child into the world without the threat of being torn apart before they even had a chance to say hello. Stumbling through an affluent, silent neighborhood, the contrast was a physical blow. Manicured lawns slept under a blanket of rain, and warm light spilled from pristine windows. These were not just houses. They were fortresses of a life she couldn't even imagine. Then she saw it. At the end of a long driveway, set back from the main mansion, was a smaller guest house. It was dark, silent, and appeared utterly empty. It wasn't a home she saw, but a haven, a roof, 4 walls, a place to be a mother, just for a moment, without an audience. Another contraction, stronger this time, ripped through her. The pain erased all hesitation. It was no longer a matter of right or wrong. It was a matter of survival for the only person in the world who mattered. The lock on the guest house door was a small, brass circle of defiance, a final barrier between her child and the storm. Another contraction seized her, a wave of fire that stole her breath and left her gasping, clutching her belly. It was no longer a choice. It was a command from a force deeper than law or morality. Her trembling fingers fumbled with a loose rock from the garden bed, its rough edges digging into her palm. She wasn't thinking about the owner, or the consequences, or the wrongness of it all. She was thinking of the cold pavement, the indifferent stairs, and the tiny, helpless life that depended on her. The world had offered her no sanctuary, so she would have to steal one. It was a desperate, jagged prayer, answered by the sharp crack of metal giving way. She pushed the door open and slipped inside, the silence of the house swallowing the roar of the wind. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of lemon polish and disuse. It was a world away from the rain-soaked misery she had just left. For a moment she simply stood there, an intruder in a land of forbidden peace, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. She didn't see fine furniture or expensive art. She saw a shield, She saw a floor that wasn't wet, walls that weren't screaming with traffic, and a darkness that felt safe instead of threatening. In the eyes of the law, she was a criminal who had just committed a felony, but in the court of a mother's heart, she was a refugee who had just found asylum. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, but a stronger, more primal instinct took over. She moved with a quiet purpose, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floors. She found a bathroom, its pristine white tiles gleaming in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Inside a vanity, she found a stack of thick, clean towels. Her hands shook as she pulled one out. The soft cotton, a luxury she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't stealing, she was borrowing. Borrowing a moment of dignity, a sliver of safety for the most important event of her life. She carried the towel back to the main room and laid it carefully on the floor, creating a small, sacred space amidst the shadows of a stranger's wealth. A pair of headlights swept across the long driveway, illuminating the room for a split second. Leah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She flattened herself against a wall, every muscle tensed. The car continued down the main road, its engine fading into the distance, but the fear it left behind was cold and sharp. In that brief flash of light, she saw herself as the world would see her, a desperate vagrant, a thief in the night, a threat to this orderly, perfect world. They wouldn't see a mother. They would see a problem to be scrubbed away, a stain on their clean conscience. The judgment of that unseen driver felt as real as the walls around her, a reminder that her sanctuary was built on borrowed time. The pain returned, sharper and more insistent, pulling her focus back to the singular, overwhelming task ahead. She knelt on the towel, her body already beginning the sacred, agonizing work of childbirth. There was no one to hold her hand, no voice to offer encouragement, only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the relentless rhythm of the contractions. She clutched the worn teddy bear she had pulled from her pocket, its familiar shape a small anchor in a sea of pain and uncertainty. It was a pathetic substitute for a human touch, a threadbare link to a childhood spent in the care of strangers. She pressed the bear to her cheek, whispering a promise to it, and to the child fighting its way into the world. You will not be alone. I will never let you be alone. The outside world ceased to exist. There was only the room, the storm, and the fierce, protective love that fueled her. She was no longer just Leah, the girl the system forgot. She was a force of nature, a vessel for a new life, performing the oldest and most profound act of creation in utter solitude. Every gasp for air, every silent scream of effort, was a defiance of the world that had cast her out. They had left her with nothing, believing she would break. They didn't understand that in taking everything from her, they had left her with the one thing that could not be taken, a mother's will to protect her child at any cost. This guest house wasn't just a shelter from the rain, it was her fortress against the world. Her mind, in the brief lulls between the waves of pain, replayed the cold, bureaucratic voices from her past, the social workers with their clipboards and empty platitudes, the foster parents who saw her as a monthly check. She could hear them now, their voices dripping with condemnation. Unstable environment, parental neglect, risk to the child. They would use her desperation against her, twisting this act of survival into proof that she was unfit. They would come with their official papers and their false smiles to take her baby away, promising a better life. The same lie that had been the soundtrack to her own upbringing. The terror of that possibility was a pain sharper than any contraction, a cold dread that fueled her resolve. With a final, guttural cry that was both agony and triumph, she brought her son into the world. In the silent, shadowed guest house, a new life began. She pulled the crying infant to her chest, his warmth a miracle against her skin. The world outside, with its rules, its judgments, and its systems, could wait. For this one perfect, stolen moment, there was no law higher than the bond between a mother and her child. She had trespassed. She had broken in. She had committed a crime that could send her to jail. But as she looked down at the tiny, trusting face nestled against her, she knew with absolute certainty that it was the most righteous thing she had ever done. She had not broken a home. She had created one. The storm was a familiar companion to Adrian Sterling, a reflection of the cold turbulence he carried within his own chest. He drove his car down the long private lane, the headlights cutting through the sheets of rain like scalpels. His mansion was a fortress of solitude, a monument to a life meticulously built and tragically emptied. But tonight, something was wrong. A flicker of movement, a disturbance in the perfect and sterile order of his estate. It came from the guest house, a place he hadn't entered in 5 years, a place that was supposed to be as silent and empty as his heart. He stopped the car, his jaw tightening. This was not a curiosity. It was an infringement, a flaw in the system of control that was his only solace. He entered the guest house without a sound, a ghost in his own forgotten space. The air was different, thicker, warmer, alive with a scent he couldn't immediately place. Then he saw her. On the floor, illuminated by a sliver of moonlight, was a young woman, her face pale with exhaustion, her clothes soaked through. But it was what she held that stopped him cold. A newborn baby, impossibly small, wrapped in one of his expensive guest towels. Adrian's mind, a machine of logic and finance, struggled to process the scene. He didn't see a mother and child. He saw a squatter, a liability, a chaotic, biological mess that had breached the sterile walls of his grief and dared to bring life into a house dedicated to death. His first instinct was not compassion, but a cold, burning rage. This was a violation on every level. A violation of his property, his privacy, and his carefully constructed emptiness. He looked at the woman, at her disheveled appearance and the desperate way she clutched the infant, and his mind delivered its swift, merciless verdict: irresponsible, unstable, a danger. He felt nothing for her plight. Empathy was a currency he had stopped trading in long ago, after the market for it had crashed and burned, taking his world with it. This woman was just another problem to be efficiently and ruthlessly removed, another piece of disorder to be scrubbed clean from his perfectly managed existence. The child was merely collateral damage. His voice, when it finally came, was as cold and sharp as the winter wind outside. This is private property. It wasn't a question or a warning. It was a statement of absolute, unassailable fact. Leah flinched, her eyes flying open to meet his. She saw a tall figure cloaked in shadow, his face an unreadable mask of wealth and power. In his gaze, she saw no mercy, only the same cold dismissal she had seen in the eyes of the security guard, the social workers, the world. She instinctively curled her body around her son, a fragile shield against the man who owned the very air she was breathing. She said nothing. What could she say that he would ever understand? Her story was not written in a language men like him spoke. He didn't need an explanation. He had already written the entire narrative himself. He pulled out a sleek, black smartphone, its screen illuminating his face in a cold, unforgiving light. His thumb moved with detached precision. He was not calling a friend or an assistant. He was calling the law. He was calling the system. "I'm reporting a break-in at my residence," he said into the phone, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "There's a trespasser in my guest house. A woman, she has a newborn infant with her." He listened for a moment, his eyes fixed on a point just past Leah's head, refusing to acknowledge her humanity. "Yes, I'll need Child Protective Services notified as well. The situation is unstable." Each word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of her hopes. Unstable. The word echoed in her mind, the same clinical term used to tear her own childhood apart. She watched him, this man of immense power, condemning her without a single question, erasing her and her son with a simple phone call. He was the embodiment of the world she had tried so desperately to escape, a world of rules made by the powerful to crush the powerless, a world where a mother's love was weighed on a scale of wealth and stability, and hers was found wanting. The terror was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing her heart, stealing the air from her lungs. This was it. This was how she lost him. The distant sound of an approaching siren began to slice through the night, a harbinger of the end. For Adrian, it was the sound of order being restored, of a problem being efficiently outsourced. He stood by the door, a silent, imposing guardian of his own misery, waiting for the authorities to arrive and sanitize his property. To remove the stain of this woman's desperate life from his own, he felt a grim sense of finality, the cold comfort of a decision made and executed. He had done what was necessary. He had protected his assets, his solitude, his grief. He was acting rationally, logically. In his mind, he was saving the child from a future of poverty and neglect. It was a cruel kindness, a judgment delivered from a throne of ice. The two of them waited in the charged silence, separated by an invisible wall of class, privilege, and pain. He was a king in a self-imposed exile, surrounded by everything and holding on to nothing. She was a refugee, with nothing but the tiny, warm body in her arms, which was her everything. He saw her as a threat to his carefully controlled world, a symbol of the chaos he abhorred. She saw him as the final judge, the executioner of her motherhood, the face of a system that had never once shown her mercy. The imminent arrival of the flashing blue and red lights was not just an interruption, it was the collision of their two worlds, a moment that would shatter one of them, or perhaps, unexpectedly, both. The flashing blue and red lights painted the guest house walls in strobing and violent colors, turning the small sanctuary into a cage. Two police officers entered, their presence sucking the remaining warmth from the room. They were a wall of uniforms and clipped efficiency, their eyes sweeping over Leah with a practiced disinterest that was more brutal than outright contempt. Adrian stood apart, a statue of cold authority, providing a clipped, factual account of the break-in. He did not look at her. To him, this was a transaction, a simple matter of removing an unwanted element. For Leah, it was the sound of the system's gears grinding into motion, the same machine that had chewed up her childhood and was now coming for her son. One of the officers, a man with a weary, impatient face, took a step toward her. "All right, ma'am, we need you to cooperate," he began, his voice flat, devoid of any empathy. "What's your name? Do you have any identification?" Each question was a stone thrown at her fragile dignity. She said nothing. Her entire being was focused on the small, warm weight against her chest. To speak would be to engage with their world, to acknowledge their power over her. Her silence was not defiance. It was a desperate, primal refusal to participate in the dismantling of her own heart. The officer sighed, exchanging a look with his partner that clearly said, "We've got a difficult one." They saw a problem, not a person. Adrian watched the scene unfold from the doorway, an unwelcome witness to the consequences of his call. He had expected a clean, swift removal. He had not anticipated the raw, suffocating silence of the woman on the floor, or the way the officer's procedural coldness seemed to echo his own. A flicker of something uncomfortable stirred within him. He was a man who prized control, who believed in order and the logical application of rules. But the reality of that order, when applied to this desperate, silent mother, was uglier and more brutal than he had imagined. He was not just an observer. He was the architect of this cold, sterile cruelty, and the realization left a bitter taste in his mouth. The arrival of the social worker shifted the atmosphere from one of legal procedure to clinical assessment. She was a woman in her late 40s, her expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. She conferred with Adrian in a low voice, her pen poised over a clipboard. "Unstable environment," he heard her murmur, the words like a physical blow. "No prenatal care records. I assume." The baby was no longer a newborn son. He was a checklist of risk factors, a case file to be processed and filed away. Leah watched the woman's pen move across the paper, each stroke a nail being hammered into the coffin of her motherhood. This was the face of the system she feared, calm, rational, and utterly merciless. The social worker approached, crouching down but maintaining a careful distance. Her voice was soft, a practiced, hollow instrument of persuasion. "Leah, my name is Carol. We're here to ensure the baby's safety." The name felt alien on this stranger's lips. The word safety felt like a threat. Leah could feel the ghosts of her past crowding the room, the countless foster homes, the other social workers with their same empty promises and clipboards. They always said they were there to help, but help always meant separation. It meant being taken away, being catalogued, being lost. She clutched her son tighter, a silent, desperate plea for them to see he was already safe. He was with his mother. Her resistance was a fortress of silence. She refused to look at them, refused to answer their questions. Her entire world had contracted to the circle of her arms, and the tiny, trusting life within it. This was not a negotiation for her. It was a battle for survival. If she gave them an inch, a name, a piece of her story, they would use it to unravel her, to prove she was unfit, to justify taking him. The officers grew visibly frustrated by her lack of cooperation, their posture shifting from routine to annoyance. They saw a stubborn, uncooperative transient, not a terrified mother using the only weapon she had left. The refusal to be broken down into a series of answers on a form. The tension in the room thickened, becoming a palpable, suffocating force. It was a standoff between the unyielding power of the state and the unbreakable will of a mother. Adrian felt it most acutely. He had initiated this, summoned these forces of order to restore his sterile peace, but the situation had spiraled beyond his control. He was now a prisoner in his own home, forced to watch this slow-motion tragedy play out. He saw the impatience in the officer's eyes and the clinical certainty in the social workers'. They were following a script he had inadvertently handed them, and he was beginning to despise the role he had written for himself. His eyes fell upon the worn teddy bear lying discarded on the floor next to her, its button eyes seeming to stare up at him accusingly. The sight of it was a crack in his icy composure. It was a pathetic, threadbare thing, a relic of a childhood spent in the sterile care of strangers. It spoke of a profound and lasting loneliness, a pain he understood all too well. For the first time, he saw past the squatter, past the problem. He saw a young woman who had been fighting this same battle her entire life, a battle to hold on to something, anything, in a world determined to leave her with nothing. The bear was not just a toy, it was a scar. The social worker stood up, her decision made. Her voice regained its professional firmness, a pronouncement from on high. Given the mother's refusal to cooperate and the obvious lack of a stable environment, protocol is clear. For his immediate safety and well-being, we need to take the infant into protective custody. The words were a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic calm. One officer took a step forward, his hands ready to enforce the verdict. This was the moment of fracture, the point where the abstract rules of the system were about to become a concrete act of violent separation, an act from which there would be no return. Leah's body went rigid. A sound escaped her lips, not a scream, but a low, guttural moan of pure animal terror, the sound of a soul being ripped in two. She curled her body over her son, making herself a human shield. Her eyes, wide with a horror that transcended fear, finally lifted and met Adrian's. They did not plead for mercy. They accused him. They showed him the devastating, absolute cost of his actions. In that instant, Adrian was no longer a millionaire protecting his property. He was a man watching a mother fight for her child, a primal scene that shattered the walls around his frozen heart and forced him to confront the ghost of his own failure. The social worker's words fell like chips of ice into the suffocating silence. For his immediate safety, we need to take the infant into protective custody. The phrase was clinical, sterile, a piece of bureaucratic jargon designed to strip the heart out of the act. It was a verdict, delivered with the detached authority of a system that saw only risk factors, not a mother and her newborn son. The officers shifted their weight, their expressions hardening into a grim readiness to enforce the decision. They were just doing their jobs. To Adrian, this was the logical endpoint of the situation he had set in motion, an unpleasant, but necessary, tidying up of a chaotic intrusion into his orderly life. He watched, waiting for the inevitable, but Leah did not scream. She did not fight. She simply broke. Her body curled instinctively, a fragile shell around the tiny, warm life she had just brought into the world. A sound escaped her throat, a low, guttural whimper of such profound despair it seemed to make the very air in the room ache. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart. Her eyes, wide with a terror that went beyond mere fear, flew to Adrian's face. They were not pleading for mercy or begging for help. They were mirrors, reflecting back at him the absolute, devastating consequences of his cold, rational decision. In their depths, he saw a horror so pure, so primal, that it bypassed his defenses and struck something deep within him he thought had died long ago. "Then," she whispered. The words were a ghost of a sound, a fragile thread of breath against the crushing weight of the room. "They want to take my baby." It wasn't an accusation or a plea directed at him. It was a statement of fact, a final, horrified realization spoken into the abyss. The words were so quiet, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow, silencing the procedural hum of the authorities. They were the purest distillation of a mother's ultimate terror, a sound that cut through class, wealth, and circumstance. For the officers and the social worker, It was a familiar, if sad, part of the job. But for Adrian Sterling, that whisper was a key turning a lock that had been rusted shut for 5 agonizing years. The world fractured. In that instant, Adrian was no longer in his guest house. He was standing in a sterile, white hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor echoing in his ears. He saw his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, her small hand lost in his. He heard a doctor's calm, detached voice delivering a different kind of verdict, using different words but carrying the same unbearable finality. Leah's whisper, "They want to take my baby," became the echo of his own powerlessness, the voice of his most profound failure as a father. He had all the money in the world, all the power a man could desire, and he had been unable to stop the system of biology, of fate, from taking his child. He wasn't seeing a stranger anymore. He was seeing himself in the cruelest mirror imaginable. His gaze fell to the worn teddy bear on the floor, its button eyes seeming to stare into his soul. Lily had a bear just like it, a threadbare companion named Barnaby that had gone with her everywhere, even into that final silent room. The sight of it, combined with Leah's desperate whisper, was a cataclysm. The grief he had buried under 5 years of ruthless work, emotional isolation, and cold logic erupted with volcanic force. The sterile fortress he had built around his heart was not just breached, it was obliterated. He saw the cold, impartial faces of the authorities, and they morphed into the doctors and nurses who had offered their condolences with practiced sympathy. They were the system, and the system was about to fail another child. This resurrected grief did not manifest as tears. It ignited into a white-hot, protective fury, a rage so potent it shocked him with its intensity. It was a rage directed at the injustice of it all, at the social worker's clipboard, the officer's holstered weapons, the cold, unfeeling machinery of a world that would separate a mother from her newborn child in the name of safety. He looked at Leah, huddled on the floor, and he no longer saw a criminal or a liability. He saw a warrior, a mother who had fought through a storm, broken into a stranger's home, and endured childbirth alone, all to do the one thing he had failed to do, protect her child at any cost. His ice didn't just melt, it flash-boiled into steam. With a sudden, explosive movement that startled everyone in the room, Adrian stepped forward. He didn't walk. He strode, planting himself directly between the advancing officer and Leah. His body became a wall, a physical barrier between the system and its intended victim. The detached, aloof billionaire was gone. In his place stood a man radiating a formidable, dangerous energy. The authority he commanded in boardrooms, an authority built on wealth and intellect, was now amplified by a raw, primal emotion no one in the room had ever seen from him. The air crackled with tension. Everyone froze, caught in the gravitational pull of his sudden, shocking transformation. His silence was more intimidating than any shout. "Shana, stop!" The word was not loud, but it cut through the room with the force of a shockwave. It was a low, guttural command, laced with a pain so deep it was terrifying. He didn't look at the officers. His gaze was fixed on a point in the distance, as if staring down the ghosts of his own past. Then his voice, raw and shaking with a fury he could barely contain, rose again. "She and the baby are staying." He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, no longer cold and empty, but blazing with a protective fire, locked onto the social worker. "They are under my protection." It was not an offer. It was not a suggestion. It was an unbreakable vow, a declaration of war against the very forces he had summoned. If this story touched you, like and share. So many people live this reality in silence. The officials were paralyzed, their training and protocols utterly useless against this sudden, volcanic display of power. They were prepared for a desperate, homeless woman, not for a titan of industry declaring his personal protection over her. Adrian didn't give them time to recover. He pulled out his phone, his thumb moving with a speed born of pure adrenaline. He wasn't calling 911, he was calling his own personal army. "Get my legal team on the phone," he snarled into the device, his voice a low growl of command. "All of them. Now." The call was an act of rebellion, a pivot from enforcing the rules to rewriting them entirely. He was turning his immense power from a weapon against her into her shield. Finally, the storm within him subsided just enough for him to look at Leah. He truly looked at her. The judgment was gone, the contempt erased. In its place was a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored her own. He didn't offer a comforting smile or a gentle word. He was too broken for that. But his eyes conveyed a message clearer than any words could. I see you, I understand. For the first time, Leah saw past the millionaire, past the cold executioner of her fate. She saw a man drowning in a pain as deep as her own. In that silent, shared moment of agony, an impossible bridge was built between the man who had everything and the woman who had nothing, a connection forged in the fires of loss. The icy authority in Adrian's voice was a weapon far more potent than any law on the books. He dismissed the police and the social worker not with a shout, but with a quiet, unshakable finality that left no room for argument. My legal team will handle all necessary paperwork, he stated, his gaze a sheet of steel. You are no longer needed here. This is private property, and these are my guests. The officials, accustomed to dealing with the powerless, were utterly disarmed by a man who could dismantle their careers with a single phone call. They exchanged uncertain glances, their procedural confidence evaporating, and retreated back into the storm. The wail of the siren faded into the night, replaced by a fragile, ringing silence. Leah watched them go, her heart still hammering, not yet daring to believe the monster had been slain. The fury in Adrian's face receded, leaving behind the raw, hollowed-out landscape of his grief. He turned to Leah, his movements stiff, as if his body had forgotten how to be gentle. He avoided looking directly at the baby, the sight still too sharp, too close to his own ghosts. Instead, he focused on the practical, the immediate. He pulled out his phone again, his voice tight and clipped as he spoke to his personal physician. I need you at the guest house, immediately. A mother and a newborn. Bring everything you need. He hung up without waiting for a reply. Then his eyes finally met Leah's, and the words he spoke were not an offer of charity, but a solemn vow. You are safe here, he said, the phrase heavy with unspoken pain. No one will take him from you, I promise. Leah's entire life had been a lesson in the treachery of promises. She remained coiled on the floor, a warrior still defending her territory, her instincts screaming that this was a trap, a different kind of cage. She searched his face looking for the lie, the price tag attached to this sudden salvation, but all she found was a profound, bottomless sorrow that resonated with her own fear. It was an agony she recognized. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to relax her hold, her muscles unknotting one by one. She did not offer words of thanks. They felt hollow, inadequate for the magnitude of the moment. Instead, she gave a single, deliberate nod. It was a silent pact, an acceptance not of his help, but of his protection, a treaty signed between two survivors on the battlefield of loss. The arrival of the physician, a gentle, older man named Dr. Alistair, marked the true beginning of her sanctuary. He did not ask for paperwork or insurance. He simply knelt beside her, his voice a low, calming murmur, and treated her with a quiet reverence that felt more healing than any medicine. He tended to her and her son with practiced, gentle hands, his presence a balm on the raw wounds of the night. Meanwhile, Adrian orchestrated a silent ballet of care. A warm meal appeared from the main house, along with soft blankets and a set of clean clothes. Each item was a quiet apology, a tangible piece of the dignity that had been stolen from her. He wasn't just giving her shelter. He was restoring the sanctity of her motherhood, one small, respectful act at a time. Hours later, the storm outside had broken, leaving behind a world washed clean. The baby, now named Noah, slept peacefully in a warm bassinet Adrian had retrieved from a long-sealed room. Adrian stood by the window, his back to her, a silhouette against the pale dawn. The east wing of the house has been prepared for you, he said, his voice soft, the words directed at the glass. For you and Noah, for as long as you need it to be your home. It was more than an offer of a room. It was the promise of a future, a key to a world she never knew existed. Leah clutched her son, his warmth a steady, miraculous anchor, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of tomorrow. Do you believe in second chances? Comment below. We want to hear from you. 6 months had passed since the storm, but the change in the Sterling mansion was more profound than any season. The East Wing, once a mausoleum of silent grief, now hummed with the quiet rhythm of new life. Laughter, small and pure, echoed in hallways that had only known the whispers of the past. Leah was no longer a ghost haunting the city's fringes. She was a quiet, steady presence, her fear replaced by a soft-spoken confidence that came from knowing her son was safe. She would walk the gardens with Noah nestled against her chest, her steps sure, her gaze calm. Adrian often watched from his study window, an observer of the warmth that had seeped into the cold corners of his world. He had offered her shelter, but she, in turn, had given him back the sound of a home. Adrian's transformation was a slow, quiet thaw. The icy precision remained in his business dealings, but at home the armor had begun to crack. He found himself lingering by the nursery door, not intruding, but simply listening to the gentle sounds of a mother humming to her child. One evening, he brought Leah into the sealed-off room that had once belonged to Lily. He didn't speak of the accident, but of the small joys, of finger paintings and a favorite threadbare teddy bear named Barnaby. He spoke of his daughter not as a ghost of his failure, but as a memory to be cherished. In Leah, he found an audience who didn't offer platitudes, but a silent, profound understanding of loss. She didn't try to fix his pain, she simply sat with him in it, offering the rare gift of shared sorrow. But safety was not enough for a spirit forged in survival. Leah could not forget the cold pavement, the indifferent stares, the terror of bringing a child into a world that had no place for them. In the quiet hours while Noah slept, she began to write. She filled notebooks not with a diary of her pain, but with a blueprint for a revolution of compassion. She designed a new kind of shelter, not a warehouse of cots, but a sanctuary that offered legal aid, job training, and childcare, all under one roof. A place where a mother's desperation would be met, not with judgment and a clipboard, but with a key and a promise of protection. She was taking the rubble of her past and building a fortress for other women, ensuring no one else would have to steal their sanctuary. She found Adrian in his cavernous study, the heart of his empire, and laid her notebooks on his vast mahogany desk. She spoke not as a beneficiary asking for a handout, but as a founder pitching her vision. Her voice, once a whisper of terror, was now steady and clear, filled with the authority of lived experience. Adrian listened in absolute silence, his face an unreadable mask. The old fear flickered in Leah's heart, the fear of dismissal, of being seen as a problem once again. When she finished, he didn't offer words of pity or praise. He simply picked up one of her notebooks, his eyes scanning the detailed plans. "This isn't a charity," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "This is a solution. When do we start?" They became partners, architects of a new beginning. Adrian's immense wealth and ruthless efficiency were now instruments of Leah's fierce compassion. His lawyers drafted charters, his accountants built budgets, and his contractors broke ground. The first site they chose was the guest house. Together they watched as the structure where she had given birth in desperation, where he had been shattered and remade, was carefully dismantled. It was not an act of destruction, but of consecration. They were tearing down a monument to their individual pain, to build a foundation of shared hope. In the space between spreadsheets and construction plans, they forged a bond deeper than romance, a partnership of two broken souls rebuilding the world, starting with their own small corner of it. On a bright, clear morning, Leah stood before the gleaming new building, Noah's haven. The keys felt solid and real in her hand, a stark contrast to the cold rock she had once used to break a lock. Noah, now a happy, babbling toddler, sat on her hip, his small hand clutching her shirt. Adrian stood beside her, not as a benefactor, but as a silent, steadfast guardian. His gaze was not on the building but on her, his eyes filled with a quiet, aching pride. She met his look, and in that shared silence, every unspoken word of gratitude, respect, and understanding was exchanged. She turned and fitted the key into the lock, the click echoing not as an intrusion, but as a welcome. "Dignity is not something you are given," she whispered to her son, "a promise to the world. It's the door you build for others to walk through." If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and send this video to someone who needs a little hope.